Um, well, I think that what question in my mind is what sort of institution or association could bring together two people who are on the same platform, speaking one after the other, who have nothing in common except perhaps some knowledge of the leader, Gustav Mahler, and the fact that they're in the same university but in entirely different subjects. And it could only be perhaps a European Public Administration Network. I actually retired from the University of Limerick. I actually retired from the University this month, where I have been Professor of European Studies for the last 20 years. And as the details of the conference rightly say, I'm now working for the United Nations Development Programme, and I have been for some years now, first in Central Asia and now in the West Balkans, and dealing with broadly speaking, democratic governance, but more directly with public administration reform. And in many ways, I mean, you've asked me to give, the organizers asked me to give reflections, and that is indeed what I shall do. I shall not attempt to, as Professor Tonen has said, I don't need to talk about curriculum changes and the technicalities of this, but rather indeed give some perhaps based very much on my own autobiography, really, because I started over 40 years ago as an assistant lecturer in public administration. I mean, that was my beginning, really, in Britain, with a rather, I now think, parochial concern with problems of civil service reform in the United Kingdom. I then later got interested in the European community, and I shall explain a little about that, and became Professor of European Studies and published and taught mainly about European integration. And now I find myself very much back where I started, which is concerned with public administration, but in a much more direct and practical sense than I ever thought possible. Actually, in the 1960s, at a time when British accession to the European community was off the agenda, not through the wish of the British, but because of the leader, the President of France at the time, did not want the issue of British accession to be discussed by the existing member states. I remember being very much involved in organizing meetings between British civil servants and their counterparts within the then six member states of the European community. And it's very funny how one's life can sometimes turn out, because I now find I'm doing very much the same thing, but in another context, in Eastern Europe, in a way I would never have thought possible, of course, at the time, in the 1960s. So very often the things one does in one's earlier life prove relevant in a way that you don't expect. So one should never undervalue any activity that one engages in. So, but I think one of the issues I want to address has already been mentioned by Professor Tonen, and that is the relationship between public administration as a discipline and public administration as a practice, or perhaps put it more largely, public administration as a philosophy and public administration as a practice. And I know this question does arise and always arises in the context of public administration, and it's arisen for me throughout my own professional career, and it still does. I ask whether there ever has been a time when there could be public administration as an academic discipline without public administration as a practice. And I think it's unlikely that one could have. So, imagine a circumstance in which there could be a discipline of public administration without the practice. Can one turn this question the other way around? Is it also true that there cannot be public administration as a practice without public administration as a discipline, without an intellectual version, without the practice of public administration corresponding to an academic or scientific representation of itself? Now, the essence of what I want to say in the short time available this afternoon is to suggest that it is above all in the context of European integration, of the Europe in which we now live, above all in that context, that it is inconceivable that public administration as mere practice could exist or be accepted without public administration as an intellectual activity. I would say without public administration as a philosophical activity, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. And I think it's very important in the European context that we recognise that for historical reasons, to which I shall allude. Before going on to that, I'd like to make another deal with another issue of terminology, which is that of European integration itself. The term integration came into the discourse of European unification relatively late. I think it came from outside Europe, and it came mainly from political scientists. I think it did not obtain any official recognition until quite late, until the Treaty of Amsterdam, and even then with no clear indication of its precise meaning. Actually, the convenience of the term integration stems from its ambiguity, because the nature of this word, I think in any language, is such that without an elaboration of the context, we've no way of knowing whether integration refers to a process or to a product. And this is precisely why it can be politically convenient in a context like that of the European Union, present European Union, where there is not agreement about any product. But it is felt widely that the process is essential, both for economic development and for political stability. It may be that the idea of the product is essential for the process to work, but whenever the nature of the product, and in this case, in terms of is the end result to be a state, or is it to be some form of closer international cooperation, whenever that issue is raised, this is very bad for the process of integration. On the whole, to discuss integration in the way in which I think those who introduced this word into the discourse, first academic and then political, who were mostly from the United States of America, who introduced this term integration, I think what they had in mind was that there ought to be a product. That this ought to be what I suppose one today would call a results-based discourse, that there should be something to come out of this. But actually, the founders of the European community in the 1950s and 1960s were wise enough to realize, indeed they had no alternative for reasons I'll mention in a moment, that except to say that we cannot discuss the product at this stage, and it has really never been possible to be clear about the product. Never been possible, but it's never been absolutely necessary either. And that is one of the beauties of the process of European integration. So thank you to the Americans for this word, because actually it does have very positive use. Because integration also can also be understood, if we understand it as a process, to mean restoring, an attempt to restore wholeness to something that has been broken into parts, that has disintegrated. It has in most languages, I think, certainly in English, also a moral connotation. One speaks in English of someone having integrity, being a person of integrity, meaning somebody who's particularly reliable, particularly trustworthy, particularly stable. And in this sense, integration can be seen as a vital quality of a political community. One that European history and European experience has taught us to value very particularly. We know from our experience that it is possible to build a state and a state structure without integration. There have been many attempts in Europe to do this, and not only in Europe, we know, but primarily in Europe, many attempts to build states, particularly nation states, without social and economic integration. We also know that it's quite possible for states having been built to disintegrate and to fall apart because of the lack of integration. Integration might be considered a nobler and higher form of activity than state building. And I think myself, my interpretation of what the founders of the European community were attempting to do was that they recognized, they were aware, they had a historical sense of this, and particularly, of course, in the time in which they acted, this was very important. I think it's significant that the term community was used of the original European community, or European communities in the plural, and the emphasis was very much on the pursuit of social and economic objectives in the common good, rather than on some abstract attempt to create state institutions. If we reflect on integration quality of political community, we can see that integration, it is very wise to pursue integration before seeking to establish states and state institutions in a political sense. Integration can be understood as a process in which I recognize what it is in my neighbour's practice that is common to my own, and therefore what is also capable of transcending the differences between us and defining the general limits to my and his pursuit of self-interest. Maybe put another way, the process of integration is so understood, undergoes, the notion of self-interest undergoes a refinement. And I come to see that I can't really gain my self-interest unless my neighbour gains his. I came across recently a review of a publication of some letters of Rousseau that had not been available before, in which Rousseau states much more clearly this sense of man as a social animal. For example, anyone can see that it is quite impossible for a man to be born, live and maintain himself in a society without depending on it for anything. And social man is too weak to do without others. He is an always needy from the moment of his birth to the moment of his death, and rich or poor could not survive if he received nothing from others. I think what the founders of the European community were trying to do, above all, their understanding of integration, was to restore to the war-ravaged Europe at the time, in the middle of the last century, a sense of universal order, what Rousseau would call police universelle. The relationship between the word police and polici and policy is very significant. Nowadays we tend to use the English term policy, whatever our original language. We might perhaps ought to resist that temptation, because we get then a better historical sense of the use of public power, the normative sense of the use of public power in society. And I think that if we look at the role of people like Jean Monnet and the others who were involved, maybe not consciously, certainly if we see it in retrospect, it was, and the term has been used by other students of European integration, a process of atonement, of restoring a sense of community that had been destroyed, not only by war, but by nationalism and the rise of the nation state. To restore a sense of moral obligation to one's neighbours, which is something more important, I mean, one's neighbours, whoever they are, something much more important than having intellectual conceptions of the public good, or even of human rights, but to be able to practice in daily life a sense of neighbourliness. And this is one way in which the establishment of the European community, and still the tradition, the lineage of the founders of the European community is still present. And I was listening to part of the Constitutional Convention yesterday in Brussels, and I see there are members of that convention who still express, not only the older ones but the younger ones too, that sense of community in the broadest sense. And that integration should be understood as a way of establishing, of restoring a sense of moral purpose to Europe. And what distinguished the community method from other attempts at international organization was, like any other federal project, that it favored government over anarchy. The fact that it did not take the form of a constitutional settlement, or that it did not lead to the establishment of a federal state, or United States of Europe, should not blind us to this fact. I think that's what Americans have had such difficulty in understanding, and have caused a lot of confusion in the study of European integration, as it happens, by the inability to grasp that it is possible to develop a sense of community without necessarily a constitutional act of that kind. But this was the construction or reconstruction of an integrated political community was the task that Monet and others consciously undertook. I'm not only, I think it's important for people like me to say this because I'm one of a declining, necessarily declining group of people who, whose lives in my lifetime lived through the Second World War and also the foundation of the European community. I'm probably one of the few people left who actually met Jean Monnet already, albeit briefly, but I think there are less and less people who teach certainly who study this subject, but also who teach it, who had that experience and who use some of these people. And I think it's important to be reminded of this. My own beginning in European integration was with an interest in the role of the European Commission. And actually the role of the European Commission is crucial to an understanding of the way in which the community method operated, in that it was an interesting combination of a bureaucratic and political body, and still is. And there were, of course, great debates in the Constitutional Convention about this. The first thing I wrote about it was called Towards the European Civil Service. Actually, the first time I came to Leuven, to this university, was in about 1968, 1969, because the only other study of this had been done by a professor in the Department of Public Administration here. It was called Europees Openbaar Amt, to use a bad attempt at the language of the university. Professor van der Meersch, I don't know where, he must have retired by now, but this was the only other study. It was a much larger study than anything I did. It was a legal study, very detailed and effective one, of the European Commission. And my own interest in it was more from a political science perspective, and I eventually produced another book called Politics and Bureaucracy in the European Community, which was mainly about this interplay. A lot of people did not understand that because it was taken as a book about European integration, but actually it was a book about public administration, because I come to it from an interest in the way in which the Commission, in its organizational structure and in its role, raised very much the question of the relationship between politics and administration. And Monet, who was the first president of the High Authority, which was the Commission's predecessor, had been head of the Commissariat Général au Plan in France, which was another kind of body which had a political role, but which was essentially seen as part of the fonction publique. There was great interest in England at that time in this kind of institution, and that is actually accidentally how I got involved in European integration, because I realized I could not actually adequately explain this phenomenon of a body which seemed to be neither fully political nor fully administrative, unless I also came to understand the process of European integration. And so that's how I eventually became a professor of European integration. So in my own experience, my own intellectual history is one where public administration and European integration have been inseparable. At least that's the way I see it. I mean, failure with my own self-expression has been that not everybody has seen it that way also. But in making these reflections, I see more and more that that's obvious. Now, there were two senses in which the community method involved, and in the European Union now it does still involve, two senses in which it involves administrative integration, and what used to be called sometimes functional integration. One is because of the role of the Commission, in that nothing can be decided, and this is still the case, and the Constitutional Convention would take this further, nothing can be decided by the political representatives of states in the Council, unless there is a proposal first from the Commission, which shows a particular and very intelligent confidence in public administration as an instrument of government. Not only in that, but also in the fact that the influence of the Commission has always operated through relations with the officials of member states. And this is something that is often overlooked. It is something that took me some time to come to realize, that it is through the Commission's relations with the Committee of Permanent Representatives, but also directly with officials of member states, through working groups and working committees, like the Management Committee that Alan Hegarty is a member of, that it's through this kind of activity, working through national administrations. So this is, it's very important to recognize that sense in which I think it's very important for the acceding states that public administration reform is so crucial in the states and continents in Europe that are
one day to accede to the European Union. And one of the, I have great difficulty right now in my own job. I speak, although this is going out over the world, this is not, I should emphasize, I'm not.
Superiors in UNDP and Serbia and Montenegro know that I'm here, but they don't know what I'm going to say. And what I say is entirely my own responsibility, and they're certainly not responsible for it. But one of the great difficulties I find at the moment is that there is a European integration unit in the Serbian government which wants funding from UNDP, wants continuation of funding. In fact, it only exists because we fund it. We pay for the members of this European integration unit, including the head of it. And I argue that it is not really so much a European integration unit that is required in the Serbian government. There is an additional question whether it should not rather be at the union level, and that I will be dealing with in the next few months, or when I go back actually immediately. But that is not so much the question as public administration reform. And actually it has been, I've had great difficulty just recently with funds being diverted to this European integration unit that I wanted to use for improving the policy coordination in the Serbian government, enhancing the role of the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet's General Secretariat. So here's an example where there may well be others, where in the acceding countries, integration having been interpreted so much as something to do with European Union, to become a member of the European Union, has distracted from the much more important task of building integration as a political community. Because only a viable community can be an effective member of the European Union, which was originally European Community. So it is integration within states, within countries, that is important, but it really should take priority over any other kind of integration. In fact, the one European integration cannot happen without integration within states. And I think this is very much what the founders of the community recognized, and the machinery that was established, which was designed, and is still, broadly speaking, designed to deal with issues that helped build a sense of community and work really at the level of administrations rather than at a higher political level. Of course, a lot has changed in that time, and I think that we were much better at dealing with these issues before the 1980s than subsequently. There is one other, and I realize I'm taking too much time, but there is another aspect of this I would like to refer to, which is actually very important for the development of my theme, which is that there is another sense in which public administration or bureaucracy was a vital issue for those who started the process of European integration. And that is, and this is something that applies very much also to the new members, that the inheritance of the European tradition is a mixed one. It is by no means, it is certainly ambivalent, it is by no means all good, the history of public administration in Europe. After all, some of the greatest crimes against humanity committed in the last century in Europe were committed by civil servants, by bureaucrats, acting on the basis of law, on the basis of legal empowerment. If we follow the works of Zygmunt Bauman in this, and I'm very convinced by his thesis that the Holocaust, for example, was and the horrifying thing was the extent to which it was seen as a rational solution, and the people who collaborated in it did so out of a sense of duty or a sense of obligation. This perversion of the idea of bureaucracy, of the idea of a rational administration, we have to have a very clear historical sense, so that the building of political community is a never-ending process. We're constantly refining it, and I think the value of the European experience in this regard is that we have arisen out of suffering to such an extent. We have had plenty of opportunity to learn how it is possible, through the intervention of political forces, for something which is designed as purely for the public good to be perverted for evil ends. We have no excuse but to be aware of that. And of course, again, I've lived through, again, two periods of I suppose the word in Dutch would be verklaring, I don't know, of sort of reawakening, reconsideration, reconfiguring of government and of view of government. One in the period of 1945, part of which was the creation of the European community. The second, of course, has happened more recently, particularly for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, after 1989. And in both cases, there is much more at stake than simply technical reforms or technical changes in public administration. It's a recognition that the use of public power can be perverted, can be used for criminal purposes. And therefore, in this sense, as it was before, as it was in the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, that we were very conscious of the need to reform public administration. That the administration, public administration plays such a vital part in the founding and early development of what is now European Union, was essentially a reaction against previous events. It came out of the resistance. And we know at a national level too, this reforming was going on and was, as I see it now, historically intimately linked to the process of European integration. So now we have the same process of reconfiguration, of regeneration of systems of governance in Central and Eastern Europe. And now, again, this is intimately related to European integration, to the enlargement of the European Union, the accession to the European Union. But it must be seen that the two go together. Both these processes must have a separate nature, but they must be seen as tied. And so it seems to me, therefore, almost impossible to regard the process of European integration historically, unless one sees it in the context of public administration. I turn the topic around, and these two aspects to me are inextricable, and therefore I doubt whether there is another subject, another discipline, another academic discipline, which is so relevant to the process of European integration, and so much in need of the kind of work that we are doing in this European public administration network. But this is so to the extent that we have and retain essentially an historical perspective. And that this is what I mean when I said I think it's very important to see the study of public administration as a philosophy, and that philosophy being intimately related to the practice, so that we cannot afford, in the light of our history as Europeans, to allow public administration, or call it public management if you will, as a practice to continue without an intellectual and philosophical practice of the same subject. We cannot afford the two to move apart. It is a moral obligation in terms of our history. We cannot both have a consciousness of history and morally allow these two to go apart in any part of the continent. And I can bear witness to that, having lived through, although suffered very little, I have to say, from the two great upheavals in European history in my own lifetime. I was going to call the conclusion the Owl of Minerva, but Hegel's famous metaphor has become rather hackneyed. But I think you'll see the connection that, and when I use the word philosophy, public administration as philosophy, I mean it in an essentially historical sense. I just quote a little from the preface to the Philosophy of Right, which is quite interesting on this subject. The pretentious utterances of recent philosophy regarding the state have been enough to justify anyone who cared to meddle with the question in the conviction that he could prove himself a philosopher by weaving a philosophy out of his own brain. Consequently, that which passes for philosophy has openly announced that truth cannot be known. The truth with regard to ethical ideals, the state, the government, the constitution, ascends, so it declares, out of each man's heart, feeling and enthusiasm. Such declarations have been poured especially into the eager ears of the young. And Hegel goes on, when we examine this idea and the way it is applied, we are almost led to think that no state or constitution has ever existed or now exists. We tend to suppose that we must now begin and keep on beginning afresh forever. We are to fancy that the founding of the social order has depended upon present devices and discoveries. We learn very little, it seems to me, and we forget very easily things. And we forget, you know, the importance in the European tradition of the building of public administration by Frederick the Great, Joseph II, and the inheritors of the French revolutionary tradition. And I will also say of the William Gladstone in England and the great reformers in English administration in the 19th century. But these things do not exist of their own. They need constant attention and constant reform, so that what is distinctive about European public administration, I suggest, and I think it's a subject that we need to discuss very much more, and will discuss very much more, is a sense of historical self-consciousness. I think this is what we can bring to the world, and it's our special contribution. But thank you very much for bearing with me so long.